I think with that, we'll be moving on to the next presenter, who will be engaging on the importance of climate and positions or positioning, and the significance of climate positioning for children and youth. Introducing Tasneem Essop, who is the Executive Director of Climate Action Network International, the world's largest environmental network of over 1,800 non-governmental organizations in over 130 countries. Tasneem is an expert on climate, energy, poverty, social justice issues, and is the founding director of the Energy Democracy Initiative in South Africa. South African born and based, Ms. Essop has significant experience in the climate movement. She's held various senior government positions in South Africa. Tasneem, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sipiso, and greetings to everybody.
Greetings, Ms. Essop. So over to you.
Talk to you about why it is critically important for youth to actually take positions on the issue of climate change, and why especially this will need to come from the youth themselves. And to do this, I'd like to start out by all of us a real culprit of the climate crisis. The climate change crisis did not happen out of nowhere. It's been caused, and it of course means if it was caused by human activity, there are culprits who actually caused this crisis. And we need to name this and understand this. So, the industrialization by the global north, 1800s, when, of course, as many of us would know, the industrialization came off the back of coal, especially the steam engines, etc., etc. That industrialization was also off the back of colonialism and extractivism in the global south, and especially in Africa, where our resources got taken out of the continent and used to create the wealth that the global north was building up. And that is the fundamental starting point of a climate crisis. The global north clearly responsible for this climate crisis historically. And so we need to talk about, therefore, is the injustice that climate change brings with it, where we have a situation where the global north has historically and currently caused this crisis, but the worst impacts of the crisis is being felt by those who are least responsible for that crisis. And particularly in Africa, where the entire continent, for example, is just about contributes 4% of global emissions. And yet, if we look what's happening on the continent, and I'm sure you've already spoken about this, the impacts have been devastating. Flooding, drought, extreme weather events, causing decimation of lives, livelihoods, and sustained decimation when, droughts, of course, creates sustained hardship. So here we have a situation where the climate crisis, not caused by Africans, yet they suffer the most. That's the fundamental injustice. Now, when you have a situation like that, and you have a continent who throughout history has actually been the victim of extractivism for the interest and development of others, not for our own development, we continue to experience that extractivism today, even in the way solutions to the climate crisis is being presented, where, global north and other interests extract from our continent. We're seeing what's happening in the Congo. Critical minerals are important for the new so-called green economy. Now, extractivism will continue, and Africa will always be those agendas. So if we do not set our own agenda as Africans, if we are not doing that strongly in a united voice, we will always be having our futures, our present, determined by others. That's clear. And if we are all watching what's happening in the world today, right now, how powerful Western forces align behind their interests, and they could not care about what that does to the lives of many in areas of conflict, in areas of war and genocide. So we have to be very clear whose agenda is driving the world at the moment and at whose expense that agenda is being driven. And the same goes for climate. How we deal with climate, whose voices are we hearing, how the powerful who have obligations to address and lead on addressing the climate crisis have obligations to the global south to finance our ability to deal with the crisis, whether that is through adaptation, as they call it. In other words, this is a reality. We need to now adapt our lives, our economies, our societies to be resilient to these impacts, and also to be able to finance the kind of losses and damage that we're already experiencing due to these climate impacts. But that's not happening. So the global north is doing two things at the moment. One, they continue to expand their use of fossil fuels, which is the key driver of the climate crisis. They continue to expand while at the same time they're insisting that global south countries must stop, which is all of us must actually phase out, because the climate crisis is a reality and will get worse. But they should have been leading that. And in turn, they should have been supporting the global south to deal with the climate crisis. And on both fronts, they have been failing. Now, if Africans, firstly, are not going to first understand what their needs are in such a crisis and other multiple crises, because they're all connected, and if Africans are not going to stand united in that position, then Africa is actually not even going to have a foot in the door of influencing those very powerful countries that dominate how we need to address this climate crisis. And we see that in the negotiations themselves, where big countries, the big wealthy countries, just dictate the terms of how we need to address this climate crisis, pushing the responsibilities of those who didn't cause it really, and then doing nothing in terms of their own obligations. So for me, things that we need to do. One, our young people on the continent really need to get actively involved in understanding crisis in its political sense, not science, not about technologies, not about the technical work, and you think it's all complicated, because it's not complicated. It is fundamentally about justice. And if you're not going to lead in the battle to ensure justice for all of us on the continent, and then in turn, justice for all in the global south, then, as I said, we will not achieve our own objectives on this continent. Others will dictate how we develop, if we develop, when we develop, who decides on what we develop about. Others will decide when we are supported, when we're not supported, when your life doesn't matter. So we've had experiences of how it has become clear that the global north are absolutely willing to consider our lives in the global south, and in Africa particularly, completely dispensable. We knew this when we recently experienced the COVID crisis, when Western countries were absolutely happy to not support us with vaccines, when we needed to save lives, they instead decided not to and just kept it, and also for pharmaceutical profit making. So our lives did not matter in that crisis. Our lives do not matter in the climate crisis. Our lives do not matter. Now, who's going to take up that fight? Who's going to make sure that our lives matter? It's not going to come from the global north. We will need to ensure that our lives matter. And the way we do that is to get organized, to understand the deep root systemic causes of these crises and the power behind it, and then unity and have voice. We must ensure, young people must ensure that our governments in Africa also stand in the interests of Africa, because often that our African governments, when there's negotiations, give up. They give up to take a strong, courageous stand against the powerful. Very few government heads of state would do that. So certainly we need to be organized as young people. You need to have voice. You need to pressure your governments to represent your real interests. And your interest is about your development, our development on the continent, on our terms, what is best for us. But of course, understanding that we are obviously part of a global commons, and we need to take responsibility collectively for the crisis that is now impacting all lives in the global south. So standing in Africa means standing for the global south. But we need you to put pressure on governments to take a strong and bold stand in the interest of Africa, not sell off our resources to go and make others wealthy, not going off to other governments and not taking a position or abstaining from positions. Africa needs voice, and the only way Africa will assert its voice is if you assert your voice as African youth. You assert your voice with your governments and make sure the governments who represent you in these big, powerful negotiations remain strong. And imagine if Africa was strong, Asia was strong, Latin America was strong. Strength. We are the global majority. We are. How is it possible that still, after centuries, we are not the ones setting the agenda? We are not deciding what the new development path should be for all of us. We are not deciding what our future looks like. We are not making those decisions. And so when I thought about coming to you with a message, my message is exactly that. Don't get into little rabbit holes of trying to think, oh, the climate crisis is a scientific thing. It's complicated. This is fundamentally about your life, justice in your life, your future, the development pathways that we decide on collectively that will ensure that we all have a better life for all. The current economic models that has been imposed on by the world, that even our governments love, has resulted in these crises, has resulted in inequality, has resulted in exacerbated poverty, has resulted in a climate crisis. And it is going to be up to us to find the new vision for the future. How do we develop in a way that ensures we address all of these multiple crises? And we can do that because on this continent, like I heard the previous speaker speak about, we have our solution. We have such long histories of leadership in solution making and innovation. And we need to be proud of that, not embarrassed by that. We should be proud about that and let that be heard in a way that the entire world sits up and recognizes Africa can lead, and it will come through the voices and the abilities and the skills and the power of young people. I will leave it there. I'm sure there'll be many questions maybe, and happy to take them. Thank you for inviting me to come and share a message with you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Essop, for that incredible message. There is an agenda, and agendas also exist within, the climate governance discourse. And I think what you're really trying to drive there is we must be aware of those agendas, one, and we must be aware of what our agenda is ourselves and drive that agenda forward as Africans, as African youth, as African children, and be unrelenting as well about it. The science might be complex, the governance issues might be complex, but at the very rudimentary level of it's about human livelihoods, and that is our agenda. Thank you so much for that powerful message. I think I'll be taking questions for Tasneem. And so if you have any questions, please engage and join in the conversation. This is a discursive session. It is about your opinions, what you have to say, and you engaging in the conversation as well. And so we have a comment from Neo Michael Musima, who says, "You are right. Indeed, we need to advocate as a single voice. We need to come together as one." Definitely true. That makes the youth statement, the children and youth statement on climate change that we are developing throughout this process, through these webinars and the conference in a couple of weeks, very important at synthesizing, that position. Thank you for that comment, Nell. Thank you for that comment. Now, if you have a comment, please, or a question, shoot, and let's engage in the discourse.
So, Peter, while people are thinking about a question, can I make I've spoken about the kind of, if I can call it that, the wider political and systemic issues around climate change and why we need one voice. I do also want to maybe talk about the climate COP that's happening at the end of the year. I'm assuming that you are preparing a statement for that COP as well. And so one of the things that is going to be super important on the agenda of that COP, of course, is the issue of climate finance. So this COP needs to make a decision about what the new finance goal will be. COP, where that decision is being made. And so you might know in the past, the rich nations committed to delivering 100 billion per year, which did not deliver fully, firstly, and of course it was too little to address such a massive crisis. Now, they are absolutely reluctant to put on the table, and they haven't yet put on the table what they are going to commit to in terms of climate finance. We, in the climate movement and in developing countries, we have been saying very clearly, we can't accept billions anymore. We are literally talking about trillions, especially if we've done we've seen the studies around this. There's something that we call the climate debt, a debt owed by the North to the global South because they've used up carbon space development, as I spoke about. That debt is between 2.5 trillion to 10 trillion. Conservative. And so what we've been saying is any discussion of finance must be looked at in that context of the debt you already owe us. It's not charity. You owe us so much money already. And so you need to put on the table 5 trillion as a most conservative and also as a down payment to the bigger debt. We know we're not going to get 5 trillion, but we're trying to force our own governments to understand you can't go into the negotiations accepting billions when you literally know that we need trillions. And secondly, it is to force rich nations to also come to the table with finance at the levels and scales that we need in the global south and in Africa. So climate finance this year, if you are going to put forward a statement for your governments, for the COP, climate finance is the key issue that needs to be resolved. And it has to ensure that it's just. It's just.
Definitely. That's the new quantified goal on climate finance. Definitely a critical issue for COP29. And the youth position on it is also very important because when talking climate debt, this is debt that, children and youth of the developing world.
Looks like we may have lost a moderator. So in trying to keep the conversation going, Tasneem, please just confirm that you can hear me.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Great. So in continuing with the conversation while he joins us, one of the main issues that we face when we talk about climate change, especially in the context of Botswana, is that we have seen this much development because of extractives. Even now, when we talk about, but we need climate action, there is the conversation of we've got these God-given gifts under our ground, like coal, which can bring in development for us. That's the first question. How do we then balance that conversation of do we just leave money underground to say the climate crisis? And then the second one, Nicole as well shared it here, of yes, there's the climate crisis, but then we've got more urgent problems as youth. We've got unemployment. We've got food insecurity. Inflation right now is really, really high. So in the conversation of that, how do we connect that with climate? And then how do we even put that into a position statement? Are we not advocating against our own futures? And now I'm handing back over to Tippy. So it looks like he's
Thank you for that, Pato. Tasneem, if you have a response for that, yeah.
Yep. This is probably one of the most challenging contradictions, right? In the global south, pretty much development is perceived to be coming through our resources that we extract, and especially our fossil fuel resources. There are two issues that we need to talk about that. If we really believed that it was through the extraction of fossil fuel that we were developing in Africa, that has caused massive development and growth, that it has benefited people, that we have addressed all the issues of poverty, employment, unemployment, etc., then we would have been the wealthiest continent in the world, right? So there's a contradiction. We assume our development only going to come through our ability to extract. But on the other hand, we've not seen the benefits. Again, it's the wealthy elites will benefit from this, and the extraction to the global north where the benefits go to. So we need to be clear about that. However, if we did this properly, and we collectively, at our independent levels in a country, in an inclusive way, planned for a just transition, because we will need to transition away from fossil fuels. The continuing on the path of fossil fuel developments into the future is not going to be beneficial to us in the end. as you have seen. The more we have, the more we emit, the bigger the climate crisis, and we're feeling those impacts. So our future isn't tied to ever increasing emissions in the atmosphere, because we suffer the most. Everything. We've spoken about this. So we're not saying you cannot use your resources at all, stop tomorrow. What we need to do at country level is to have plans for a just transition, where we want to be by 2050. What would we need to do now to be able to achieve those objectives by 2050? If we're going to phase out fossil fuels by 2050, what do we need to build up in terms of our reskilling, our education systems, the economics, the way we would move from fossil fuels to new energy, clean energy like renewables. But you can't just close something and then suddenly you have nothing, but we want to move to the... So it's a planned process. It's a process of planning. And you have to do that in an inclusive way, because just transition planning is all about procedural justice, the inclusion of all, and especially the youth. So yeah, we firstly should understand when we say, but we need this, and especially our governments, they love to say this, we need to use our fossil fuel resources for our own development. Then you need to ask your government, so if that was the case, why are we not developed? Why do we still not have jobs? Where is the growth that you said was going to come from all these resources? So challenge that thinking. And then secondly, sure, governments, all of the partners in a country start doing the hard work of just transition planning, because that's when you set agendas. You decide on your development pathway. You decide how you will use your resources in that transition. You decide the terms of which, if other countries need your resources, you decide how that will happen. So just transition is the critical, I suppose, needed to have robust planning from how we move away from fossil fuels and other harmful economic activities towards much better, equitable development. Development that will benefit all, not just the few. So that's the one response I'd like to make there. Do not be fooled by this notion that we need we need fossil fuels to develop, because we would have been the wealthiest economies in Africa, and we wouldn't have the problems that we're dealing with, especially unemployment. And so on the issue of unemployment, about the basics, etc., you know, again, our governments have not put in policies and measures that have actually forefronted the needs of its own people. They haven't done that. It's constantly, and you know, they try to confuse us with all this economics. Yeah, we have a balance of, we need dollars, we need to trade, etc. We have a trade imbalance, etc., etc. But we need to make sure that we don't put our countries into debt. Who makes those decisions? Why have we decided to allow our country to be in debt as well? You know, and so sovereignty becomes critical. How do we ensure sovereignty? Who makes decisions about, for example, the history of Africa? Food. We supposedly the food basket, or we were the food basket. Someone else decided what you need to grow on the continent. Cash crops for others' needs, not our own needs. All these things are systemic. They are root causes for why we are in this dilemma. We need to take back control. And when we decide what's good for our country, what kind of economy we want, our sovereignty, of course, addressing unemployment would be the key to that. So you would have to look at the kinds of sectors that would be clean, but also employment generating. It's in your hands. Yeah. You have to pressure the government.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Tasneem, for that strong messaging. We need to take back control, because these other developmental issues are systemic issues. And so, yeah, we need to own the agenda as well. Thank you for those contributions, Tasneem.